magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld I'm Brent, and tonight I'm here with Autarch of Renown James Boon Kelling, whose Craftworld Eldar have performed impressively on the tournament scene since the Codex dropped, and perhaps most notably last month at Flying Monkey Con, where he finished in 4th place out of a field of 109 players. In addition to his strong competitive track record, James is a content creator for Goonhammer, my own favorite 40k website, where he authors the majority of the articles specifically about Craftworlds. Thanks so much for being here, James.
Yeah, you bet, Brent. Thank you.
So before I do these interviews, I give my patrons the opportunity to suggest questions, and one of my patrons wants to know, if you, James, were an aspect warrior, what shrine would you belong to?
I can honestly say I've never been asked that before. I think Warp Spider.
Nice. Why Warp Spiders?
Honestly, ever since like the very beginning, I thought they were the coolest shrine. Kind of mysterious in a way, and they really zip around. Kind of do. You know how in some games there's like snipers and they feel like they're playing the game without ever really playing the game. It's
oh, for sure.
How Warp Spiders feel.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, no, I like that. I remember really liking the original second ed fluff for them that compared them to these like little things that climb around inside of the Infinity Circuit, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So what drew you initially to Craftworlds?
So I think like a lot of people, I was pretty young. A friend's older brother introduced us to the game. And, one day I went into like a local hobby town, USA, and saw these cool blister packs, and I saw this thing that said Dark Reaper Exarch, and looked at it, thought it was really cool, and picked it up, and it's kind of started from there. I don't know if you remember the old Web of Skulls.
Oh, totally. Web of Skulls. Yes. I was sort of hoping that in the 9th Ed Codex, we'd get like a Web of Skulls Exarch power or stratagem something as a callback, and we didn't quite get there. But
it's funny because they keep throwing like close combat stuff at Dark Reaper Exarch.
I know. Yeah.
It's cool, like throwback.
It's a cool throwback. Yeah. It would be cool if it were like a strat that you could trigger for Overwatch if you got attacked by Deep Strikers or something. Just this really niche-y situational thing. But as an Exarch power, it's just so not good. So I have a lot of general questions about competitive play, but I'd like to start by discussing what distinguishes your lists from a lot of the other competitive Craftworld rosters out there, because a lot of what you run is pretty standard. You lean into Ulthwe, you often have Eldrad in there, you use the typical complement of Howling Banshees and Baharroth and a second Farseer, but I think one of the most interesting things about your lists is you're a longtime fan of 7 Wraithguard with D-sides as an anchor unit, which is a bold and unusual move. Can you talk about what role they fill in your lists and how they play on the table?
Yeah. So I think you pretty much hit it on the head in that it's I would say fairly typical Ulthwe list. You have a lot of your kind of, and really this is I think an unfortunate part of not just the Codex but 9th edition in general. You kind of have your staple units that if you're going to pick a faction, you're going to run these units, right?
Sure.
But the D-sides are, to my knowledge, I think still probably one of the most unique picks out there. I like them primarily because I think they tend to surprise people. I think they're good into just about everything in the game right now. People look at them and they go, how much damage do they do? And I'll tell them 1 damage, but they get D6 shots, strength 10, AP 4, and with mortal wound kickers. And it never really connects for people how much damage that really means when it's strength 10 and AP 4. Yeah. Until they get hit by it, and then they go, oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, I feel like the game really, in many ways, rewards volume of fire right now, especially with good strength and AP, especially with good AP. And I'm one of the people who, when the Codex dropped, really overlooked the potential of the D-sides with the limited range and the 1 damage. But yeah, when you start thinking about it, especially with the mortal wounds they put out, I feel like that's pretty significant. Can you talk about some specific targets that are maybe meta picks that they play well into at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, they are blast weapons, right? So that kind of overrides their data sheet ability. But as you know, as a blast weapon, anything that's going to be 6 models or more. So I mean, a lot of crisis units are 6 models or more, right? 'Cause
Sure.
you add in the shield drones or whatever they might be. But anything that's going to be impacted by blast is going to be a good target for them. I mean, even knights, like any knight is a good target for them, because it's all about the chip damage, right? And you can start to plan for the chip damage when you start thinking about, all right, where are my scorpions at? Where are my banshees at? Et cetera, et cetera. So you can use them to take down a target that they might not one-shot, but in conjunction with something else in the list, it starts to add up real quick. And I think importantly, you know, when I use them, they almost always come out of deep strike. I've tried starting them on the board a few times and then phantasming them into reserve. But they are truly a little bit too slow for that. They do get screened backwards. And so deep strike allows them to kind of be a little bit more flexible. It's tough for an opponent to screen a full board than it is just the board edges, particularly just 2 board edges. So, you know, they do get their Alpha Strike hit usually.
Yeah.
And then they're just incredibly tough.
What sorts of enhancements are you putting on them to make them tough? One of my patrons is wondering how you keep them alive. I mean, it's a big investment of points.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I think the unit comes in at 315. So generally speaking, and the only reason I play them is because of Ulthwe. I think that's really realistically the only way you're going to get the use out of them. But you know, when you think about what they are, they start with a data sheet of toughness 6 with a -1 damage, 3 wounds apiece. And when Ulthwe, you know, they're going to get the 6-up invulnerable save. So now Strand's dice are always applicable to them. But then Eldrad with his +1 to cast, and then if you look at my list, I also have a Seer Council where the 2-foot Warlocks will stick around Eldrad to give him an extra +1 to really ensure, you know, reliable casting with his reroll. And I'll drop, you know, anything from Fortune, Guide, and Will of Asuryan mostly on him. And then if I can, I'll use the Strand's dice on the Warlocks themselves to put Protect. So if you manage to drop them into, say, terrain, even if you only get 1 or 2 of them in terrain, it's still valuable.
Yeah.
But now you're looking at a 1-up save with, you know, a 6-up invulnerable, 5-up feel no pain, -1 damage. It's just the amount of effort that your opponent has to put into to try to move them off an objective or move them off a terrain piece is just absurd.
Do you also use lightning fast on them?
Sometimes I will. Yep. And if I can, I like to get all of them into defensible cover.
Right.
So that I can get that 5-up, you know, set to defend Overwatch.
Sure.
Which with Guide is, you know, you're gonna murder a lot.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the rerolls on Overwatch, people forget that Guide applies across the whole turn. That's big. I think so. Do you ever put Conceal on them?
I don't. So I don't have Conceal on my list. I think another thing that's probably relatively unique to my list is that my bike Warlock actually has the Ghosthelm.
Yes.
And so he's the one that's going to go and do kind of your psychic interrogations. You know, with 22 inches on the advance, he's able to usually get into a position where I don't have to even get denied by anybody if I'm not facing mostly psychic characters.
Yeah.
But even if he doesn't, you know, an unmodified 9 for him is undeniable.
Right.
But even if you don't quite get that undeniable, the +1 on the initial cast, and by the way, unmodified, right? So it has to be a straight dice roll. But even if you don't, that +1 on the cast often goes a long way, even into things like Tyranids or Grey Knights.
Sure.
I don't love using a Strand's dice on him because, you know, there's a 1 in 6 chance of miscasting at that point.
Right.
And it's still unlikely that you'll die from it, but it has happened.
Right.
And that usually, messes up the turn a bit. But
Yeah, I mean, can you give us an overview of your HQs and the psychic powers you're selecting? It sounds like this is definitely a big part of your game, which makes sense. I mean, it's an Ulthwe list. So you have the Seer Council Warlock, 2-foot Warlocks, right? You've got the Bike Warlock and you've got Eldrad. What are they outfitted with? What's going on here?
yeah, so we just kind of talked about the Bike Warlock. He does have Quicken.
Okay.
And he also has, I think I gave him Focus Will. Neither one of those ever get used unless I'm not taking Psychic Interrogation, which is pretty rare.
Okay.
I guess the only time I would consider not taking Psychic Interrogation is if I'm facing like a Knights list that's almost all Armigers and only one character Knight.
Right.
That might be a consideration. Just depends if I want to deal with a big Knight stomping around for 3, 4, 5 turns.
Sure.
But the other, so I have 2 Farseers. One's Eldrad. He comes with Guide, Fortune, Will of Asuryan. We kind of talked about the use for those on Wraithguard, but I think importantly, actually, the Shroudrunners love all of those as well. And Shroudrunners, I think, are one of the best units in the list, to be honest.
Yeah, those were kind of a sleeper unit. They didn't, in the early days after the Codex dropped, they didn't see a lot of play, and now suddenly they're fashionable.
They have a remarkable amount of utility. We can get into it in a moment. I'll kind of run through the other Farseer in the council quick. But the other Farseer, I'll be honest, I struggle with him sometimes. He's very utility, but he's kind of expensive for what he ends up doing. But he is a backup caster for Psychic Interrogation. If I don't get the CP for the actual cast of Psychic Interrogation, then I'll use him to get, Fateful Divergence.
Right.
And then he's my emergency Doom caster. Unfortunately, the list doesn't have enough points to put him on a bike.
Sure.
But he does do very well kind of holding down the backfield, just being a random utility guy. Maybe he'll go jump on an objective behind a wall or something. And he'll give me that CP every turn, or at least guarantee it.
Right.
And then just the Seer Council, which again, boosts Eldrad, makes his casting super reliable. So whether it's the Shroudrunners or Scorpions, Banshees, or the Wraithguard, just making sure that whatever he wants to go off goes off. And then they themselves carry Protect and Jinx. I very rarely use Jinx. I think since the last edition change, it's more difficult. It still has its uses.
It is. Yeah, I miss Long Bomb Jinx. That was great. It's hard to set it up now, I think, and often we need Protect. Are you using? So you have Quicken on the bike that is often doing the interrogation. So it sounds like you're not doing the thing where you zip him out and he interrogates and then you quicken him out of there.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, so if to be honest, I'm fairly willing to sacrifice the Bike Warlock if I need to.
Okay.
I don't want to. Obviously, that's not the default position.
Right.
But if I need to get the points, I will risk him, knowing that I have a Farseer that I can still use for that same purpose.
Right.
Is kind of like that backup caster. I would, like I said, if I had the points, I would swap them so that I could do the yo-yo with the Bike Farseer. But in some ways, that's challenging, right? Because then when you need Doom, you still need to cast like Interrogation, and
sure,
it's just challenging. But I think Quicken comes into play very rarely. Like I said, if I'm not taking Psychic Interrogation, he does have additional use. I'll probably take something like Behind Enemy Lines, and just getting that second unit into the enemy's deployment zone is a big help with Quicken.
Sure. So are you ever quickening the Wraithguard themselves? It sounds like you usually bring them in out of Deep Strike, but...
I don't, because I want them to be shooting every turn.
Right. So it sounds like you're maybe not doing the Chaos Space Marine thing where you try to seize a central board objective with them, or is that sometimes how you play?
It depends. I think what's important to remember is that the list does have 5 D cannons.
Right. Yep.
And it kind of acts as an umbrella in a way. So you'd almost think of it as like, I'm going to set up, 2 to 3 or maybe 4 objectives that I want to cover with my D cannons. And then the Wraithguard kind of serve as that little bit of a push forward. I don't necessarily want to be fighting on my enemy's board half. I want to make sure that they can't touch my deployment zone, basically.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's kind of acting as a midfield deterrent. And a rock solid one.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly hit like a truck, right? It's and those larger units of D cannons, I think, are appearing in a lot of well-performing Craftworlds lists. James, do you mind if I post your Flying Monkey Con list to the video description so people can follow along there as we talk?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So one of my patrons complained that when he runs Ulthwe, he finds himself smashing through CP at an alarming rate. And a lot of the tricks are CP dependent. Can you talk about how much CP you need to go into the game with to make your tactics work, and how you think about CP over the course of a game?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is going to really throw, I think, a lot of people. I often will start a game with 0 CP. The list starts with 3, but I will usually, like I said, deep strike the Wraithguard, really make sure that they're going to get their opportunity.
Yep.
And then it just kind of depends on what the board state looks like. So, I mean, one of the things I always tell people is that you have to work with what your opponent gives you. So you can always walk up to the table with your plan and how you're going to approach it. But that's usually going to go out the window the moment your opponent starts putting stuff on the board. And you have to adjust to that. And so oftentimes, like for instance, I'll take Scout the Enemy, and I want to make sure that, you know, my Rangers are going to be able to get into a position where they're going to, you know, be scoring. And that usually means putting them in reserve with Phantasm, and,
Right.
or at least 2 of them, right? And so I'll often start with 0 CP. I'll get my first one, you know, on my opponent's turn. But generally, reliably, I'll get 3 a turn. 1 for them, 1 for me, and then 1 for either Psychic Interrogation or Fateful Divergence, if that doesn't work.
Right.
And really, I think it comes down to basically 3 stratagems that I most use, or at least keep in mind. The forewarning strat is always going to be front and center, especially against something like, you know, basically anything that wants that deep strike or deep strike move in the movement phase. If it's something like, I forget which one it is, but I think the Thousand Suns have one where they come in the psychic phase. I don't have to worry about it.
Right.
But the Guardian one for +1 to hit, I think that one is almost every turn, especially with the D cannons.
Oh yeah, it's so good on the D cannons.
Yeah. And, you know, a tip about the D cannons, I think a lot of people like to set them behind the wall and forget about them. The rule around the non-line of sight shooting is that if any part of the unit can see directly, the entire unit can shoot normally.
Right.
So you can always kind of, you know, play with the obscuring edges and lips and try to create that death allay that you need in order to shoot normal.
Yeah,
then,
which is awesome.
Like I said, lightning fast.
Are you ever firing and fading them? It's pretty expensive.
I have before. It's not something that I, you know, look forward to doing.
Yeah.
Because you're right. It does cause you to kind of, you know, lose out elsewhere. 2 CP is a lot. But sometimes you really need to get something dead, and sometimes you can't afford to lose your cannons in the fire back.
Yeah. No. Sure. So it sounds like for the secondary game, you're pretty consistently running Scout the Enemy and Psychic Interrogation. What are you looking to for a third secondary objective?
Yeah, so I mean, that's always the biggest question, right? Like, what's going to be the third secondary? It's probably the hardest thing since eighth started. It really depends. I mean, there is a lot of Knights players out there. There's a lot of Necrons. There's a lot of things that give up, you know, bring it down or no prisoners. So I mean, that's always an opponent-dependent thing, and if I have that option, I will always take it. Assassination's pretty rare, I'll be honest. It's kind of one of those things, unless it's like Imperial Guard or something where I know I can snipe out characters relatively easy, or something like that. But in missions that allow it, so about half of them, Wrath of Cain, Hidden Path.
Yes. Yeah. So
I do need to note. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you say missions that allow for it, I have at some point I did a guide on when I think it's a good idea to take what secondaries, but I'd love to hear you explain when you think Hidden Path is an appropriate secondary pick, because it can be really good, but it can also be a trap.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the first piece, and this is something that often flies under the radar, is that you're just not going to take it in about half of the missions. And the reason is because it requires that the objective you select be more than 6 inches outside your deployment zone. And unfortunately, in 4 of the maps, that's just the only objectives you're going to take is either a center objective or one in your opponent's board half.
Right.
That's just not a good pick.
Yeah.
The other one, which is I forget what it's called right now, but it's basically the new version of priority targets, the one where you move the objectives before the game.
Oh yeah, yep. You right. That could be great for Hidden Path if you go first, right?
Yeah, if you have the opportunity to move your objective first, you can move it outside that 6-inch deployment kind of demarcation line, and then you can select it. But if your opponent knows that and they can choose first, they can always kind of upend that one. Beyond that, so I mean the corner deployment ones are the ones that I think is probably most common, and you really have 3 options there. You have the top left corner, the lower right corner, and then the center. And it really just depends on what your opponent, has in terms of speed and their ability to kind of push you off. Your closest one is always going to be the one that's, if you're kind of looking at your deployment zone, it's going to be the one that's in the upper left. That's probably the one you can most easily defend. But if the terrain doesn't help you, or if it doesn't support you being able to defend that, then it becomes challenging. And if your opponent is fast or they have a lot of OPSEC, then that might also become challenging. But I mean, generally speaking, with Baharroth, it is a pick that you can certainly work around and to secure.
Sure. So it sounds like you're going kill the objective if possible. If not, maybe Hidden Path. What do you do when neither of those is on the table?
Yeah, so scout the enemy is pretty common. I don't love this one, behind enemy lines. It is something that you can certainly work it with, especially when you have Shroud Runners, a Viper.
Oh, did I say behind enemy lines? I meant scout the enemy. I may have misspoken.
Yeah, so if scout the enemy's not available, then I almost have to go to behind enemy lines.
Oh, right. No, I meant to ask. I actually don't remember what I said, but if so, you take scout the enemy, you take psychic interrogation, and then in matchups where you don't have a killy objective available and Hidden Path's not an option, what are we leaning into as our last option?
Yeah, so if there's not a good option at that point, then it's behind enemy lines.
Okay.
I have to double check. I'm fairly certain that Hidden Path and behind enemy lines are in the same category.
Yeah, I think so. The one of my Patreons wanted me to ask you in your lists, you're mostly running Guardian or scouts, in the troop slot, and that makes sense, right? You're doing scout the enemy. It helps in your secondary game. It's also just a cheap troop choice. Do you think that there's any room for Guardians in competitive play and the types of lists you're running?
Oh, it's so hard. I want to make them work. I love the new models that they've made.
They're so nice.
They're so nice to paint, actually. Like the old ones are tough to paint because they run together, but the new ones stand out as nice. Yeah, they're hard. They're tough right now. At the end of the day, what you're getting is T3 models that are not really high in output, and they're kind of a large footprint at 10 model unit sizes. They're difficult to hide. They're difficult to keep alive, without considerable investment.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can make them good, but they're so resource intensive that it's hard to justify not spending those resources on something else.
Right. I think in previous versions they've had some play in like a Hail of Doom list or something like that. I'm sure someone out there is doing some good things with them under some specific circumstances, but I struggle to see, at least in my current play style, how they're going to fit in without some changes.
Sure. I think I find one of the most difficult aspects of playing Craftworlds competitively right now is the primary objective game. They're so fragile, and there's so many dominant meta lists that are so durable that even with the extraordinary damage output of a Craftworlds list, it can be difficult to shift them. I think a lot of competitive Craftworlds players find themselves losing on primaries. Can you talk about how you think broadly about the primary game?
Yeah, it's a really good observation. I think right now, when you think about competitive Craftworlds, you have, let's leave Inari out of the discussion for now. I think you have, the Hail of Doom list that is still very deadly. And then you have Ulthwe. And they play completely opposite of one another. I have previously played a version of Hail of Doom, but with the most recent changes to the Nephilim packet, I went more towards the Ulthwe. And a big part of that, I have to admit, is I would say the influence of Ben Sherwin, who's one of the local guys here, teammate of mine, friend that also plays Craftworlds here and there. He kind of, in our games, me on Hail of Doom in the previous kind of iterations of Craftworlds, and then him on Ulthwe. What I've learned is that Hail of Doom, like I said, still hits real hard. Is so good at kind of picking up units, but as you say, it really struggles to kind of stay on the board once it hits, especially with some of the changes to like matchless agility and fire and fade, etc., etc. And Ulthwe is just very good at scoring secondaries. And because of the Strands dice, because of its 6-up invulnerable save, because of its, occasional 5-up Feel No Pain against mortals, it does have a little bit more stickiness than I think a lot of people realize. And I'll tell you what, the number of times I've left just one ranger alive on an objective while playing Ben, and infuriatingly so, is far too many.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, what it is you have to, with Craftworlds, and Ulthwe I think does this better than anyone else, is pick a couple of areas and just lock it down. And a big part of that is the D-cannons. Just to ensure that, you're going to get at least one or two of the objectives. And then you're basically trading or forcing your opponent to say, I'm only going to get 2 objectives, but that's fine because you're only going to get 2 objectives. And then we're going to battle this out in secondaries. And if you go second, that's in your favor. If you go first, you're going to have to work it a little bit to kind of figure out, how can I pick someone off an objective, to make sure that they don't get the turn 5 advantage. But that's really, I think, the nature of it is you definitely have to sacrifice stuff. The Wave Serpent is in there for that purpose. It can go sit on a center objective. And even if it dies, which it'll take more fire than is necessary, it'll still be able to kind of drop some troops out there that hopefully can continue to hold an objective for a turn.
What are you doing about the big blocks of CSM Terminators that can't be hit on a 1 through 3, no rerolls, -1 to wound? That's because I feel like CSM players can pretty easily lock down 3 objectives on a 5 objective board, which can really make it tough to keep up. What's your move there?
Yeah, so I'll admit it, I haven't had a ton of experience into that CSM Terminator block. As I think about it, I tend to take the approach that I do with a lot of those type of Terminator units, and there's been a lot over the years. Just off the top of my head, Black Templar come to mind with some of their abilities, in earlier iterations of 40k. Grey Knights and their Paladins, some others. Trying to think of who else, all random. But at the end of the day, 1,000 Suns in there, Scarab, a cult.
Sure.
At the end of the day, it's about sacrificing to keep them at arm's length, unless, that's a unit where you have to either ignore them or go all in. If you do somewhere in the middle, you're just wasting shots that could go elsewhere, or you're kind of putting yourself in a position that, you're not doing enough damage to the other parts of the army.
Sure.
It is an anvil, right? It's kind of like the Wraithguard, and in some ways, when my opponents shoot at the Wraithguard, I'm fine with that. Like if they kill them all, that's unlikely. But even if they do, that means that they've probably spent their entire army shooting at a unit that is good, but probably not worth an entire army's worth of shooting in combat and so on and so forth. It can only be so many places at one time, right? Dark Angels did this. One of our other locals, Charlie Andre, he used to run like 40 Deathwing Terminators. And the way you would approach that is by avoiding the 10-man blocks and picking them off on the 5-man blocks. And with CSM, it's kind of similar in that way. You're fast. You're Craftworlds. You can get around. You can keep them at arm's length, and you can get into their backfield units and try to pick them off and force some distress elsewhere. Right. If you ever get someone walking backwards on a board, you're winning the game.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. So I want to talk in a moment. I want to ask you about the London GT, which is a big elephant in the room at the moment. But is there anything else that you want to share, either about your list or about Craftworld tactics in general, before we talk about London?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anybody, but movement with Craftworlds, and I would say in particular, knowing, using obscuring and walls to your advantage, I think is probably more important for a Craftworlds player than many other faction players, just because your units are very expensive. They're not really that tough. And so if you're giving your opponent, free shots by, just hanging a sword out over the edge of a liberal terrain, right? Like past that obscuring line. If you're not checking those things, if you're not kind of using the movement to your fullest advantage, you in a lot of ways, you're leaving a lot on the table with Craftworlds, and I think that's one of the harder things for players to pick up on over time.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a skill too that you learn by playing. That's not like somebody gives you a quick tip and now you're good at that. Do you think that's one of the things that makes Craftworld such a high skill cap, but really punishing army to play?
I do, yeah. I think, they hit very hard. But if you're not careful, you can get just as easily tabled before you even get the chance. And I think that's a big part of it, yeah. I think in general, movement's the hardest part of the game, whether that's movement phase or charge or fight phase. And all of those are very important.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well said. There's no quick fixes. Do you find yourself thinking about the charge phase and the consolidate and the pile-in as essentially another movement phase with your melee units?
It can be. I would actually, this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately as well, is that for a lot of listeners, they might recall 8th edition tri-pointing was a big deal.
Can you just remind newer players what that is?
Yeah. So tri-pointing is where you use your consolidate or pile-in movement in combat to essentially lock a model in combat, such that they can't fall back because they can't fall back through your base. And that doesn't work for fly or things like that. But for infantry that's non-fly, you can certainly prevent your unit from being shot by locking their unit in combat. Now they have a strat, but this is where I think this comes back up again, is we are so CP constrained in the current iteration of 9th edition.
Right.
That tri-pointing is actually, they can certainly spend the CP to fix it, but now it's a real decision. Before it was a no-brainer.
Right.
Now it's tough.
Sure, it's because if they're going to spend 2 on that and 2 on Insane Bravery, that is brutal on some pretty trivial stuff that you don't want to be spending points on at all.
Right. Yeah.
Cool, man. That's great. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's really nice to get tips, and on the other hand, I think that the tough reality of Craftworlds is that there are aspects of the army that you just have to figure out with repetition, and it sounds like that's the kind of skill you're talking about when you talk about that mid-table play and thinking about lines and edges. It's definitely a thing that I need to be better at. You can lose a whole game in one turn because 2 units are an inch and a half off of where they needed to be, which is brutal, but maybe also part of the fun of the army, right? Space elves, super hard hitting, super fragile. All right, let's talk about the London GT. I'm sure that there are people listening to the interview who are wondering whether we're going to discuss it. That you had the misfortune to be part of a game that resulted in a 0-0 score and caused a kerfuffle. Without naming names or casting aspersions, can you talk about what happened?
Yeah. Man, it was a frustrating game. So I think there's a lot to this, and I think that the two parts that I would like to take away is, the idea of bullying at a table, and then in some ways, what is the role of judging? So my opponent and I, is actually kind of funny because after round one, I had, looked at his list, and I made a comment to some friends that I thought I matched up very well into it. And I kind of wanted to play it. It's not, my opponent is a top player in the UK. He's just a top player in general. So you never really want to man, I can't wait to play this guy round two.
Mm-hmm.
But it did look like a kind of a fun game. If you're not familiar, he was running, I think it was 175 racks or something like that, with the new Army of Renown. So it's just a mass of T4 bodies that, at some point get a 4-up, feel no pain.
Yeah.
But, between the D cannons and the D sights, I'm able to pick up because of the blast rule. I'm able to pick up quite a bit of turn. Mm-hmm. And I was. And so it was around turn 2 or 3, and I had been using my D cannons to wall block. And if you're not familiar with wall blocking, it's essentially you can line a wall. This is a rule that GW recently instituted to prevent it, but then they rescinded it again because their fix was worse than the original problem, basically. But it's very common, especially in the GW events, where you will line a wall with infantry or whatever it might be, but essentially that you'll put them more than an inch off the wall so that they can't be engaged through the wall.
Right.
But close enough that you can't fit a model inside the building.
Yeah, it's a pretty standard tournament tactic, especially for Craftworlds.
Right. And so I had been using my D cannons to wall block to prevent the racks from advancing and charging into my backfield. And that led to a judge call to verify whether or not they could wall block or not. In the process of that, I explained to him that, if this was going to be an issue, I could have just done this, which is to place the crewmen in there, which the rule basically makes it so that they're unchargeable. This was a mistake on my part. It really just gave them extra ammo to talk about it. Right. So we really had 2 judge rulings on that because of that. I shouldn't have done it. It was a mistake. But it's one of those things where it's this is obvious, this is common, and really this is moot because I could have done this. But overall, that resulted in about a 25-minute judge call. And the clock was paused during the whole thing. But what that meant is that our game was always going to run into the break. Everyone's going to finish their games on time. Right. And we're going to have 25 or so minutes extra. Well, by about turn 4, my opponent had clocked out. And so I'm the only one left with time. As we moved into the break, the judges came around and started telling us, we only have so many minutes left, and then you need to end it, which was frustrating. Especially, I'm looking at my clock, I've got about 18 minutes left and told in 5 minutes I need to be done. So we're moving through the turns very rapidly at this point. And, graciously, the judges did allow me to take the key actions I needed to win the game. Right. And by this point, a crowd had formed, and everyone's watching because the game's into the break. It's it's me and my opponent. and we're coming up to the end. I finally finished the last action I need to take. We go, okay, we call it. Let's tally it up. And it was at this point that my opponent had decided that I didn't take 2 actions. I argued that I did. I pointed to the board state to show that, all of the units that did the actions are in place to have done the actions. They didn't do anything else. But we went back and forth on it. It got heated. And the judges, told us that if we don't submit a score, we'll both take a 0 and a loss, that we need to submit the score. But, the problem is that we were arguing over what the score was. The actions are obviously, the points that are critical for the win, right?
Right.
So, obviously, we couldn't come to, it was a case of he said, she said. If someone's going to say that you didn't take an action, there's no way to prove that you did other than to look at the board state and go, it's obvious.
Yeah. Especially when you're not actually playing the turns out all the way, when you're just saying what you're doing at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to be honest. I was really frustrated. At one point, I kind of raised my voice, might have been yelling, because I guess from my standpoint, once you kind of just deny that something has been done or that something hasn't been done, and it has been done, it's kind of, there's no moving forward after that. There's an inability to come to a conclusion. Like, the social contract is broke at that point. You need someone else to resolve it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where, I look at the judges and say, they should have stepped in.
Well, let's talk through what is the practical thing to do to avoid or deal with situations like this. But I also just want to stop and say for newer players who might be considering whether they want to participate in tournaments, I think we should acknowledge that what happened in this game is really very unusual. There are a lot of people who circulate at the edge of the hobby who I think are maybe hesitant to play tournaments because there is this reputation for a toxic tournament culture that may have been warranted at some point in the past. But I think right now, it really isn't. James, do you think it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of tournament games are affable and players are really pretty cool about playing by intention?
I can honestly say I've never seen anything like this.
Yeah, this is so. If you're out there listening to this and you're thinking, "Wow, this is exactly why I don't want to play tournaments," understand that the reason we're talking about this is that this is so insanely outside of the norm. 40K is a complex game. There are places where the rules are open to interpretation, and 2 fair-minded, well-intentioned people might be able to interpret the same thing differently. And sometimes people also just make honest mistakes. And the simple truth is also that there might occasionally be people who really do behave badly. But I can only think of one tournament game in the last couple of years that was unpleasant in any way. So we're talking about an outlier situation. But given that is the case, in the wake of what happened, I assume you have thoughts, right, on how going forward you would mitigate or avoid this kind of situation.
Yeah. So, before I kind of jump into that, I kind of like to expand on something you had said, and that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is a lot of conflict, and I put, quote, quote, conflict that happens, or disagreement that happens at a table over something, really comes down to 2 different kind of cultural groups meeting for the first time over something, right? So, when you go to especially regional large tournaments, you have people that are coming from different player bases all over the place.
Sure.
And every one of them, plays certain rules under certain ways, and they kind of understand the game within the structure of their local community.
Right.
Right. And it's at these tournaments that everything kind of comes together and things are explained in different ways for the first time. Right. And that's honestly, I've most of the times it's never been a problem. It's never caused any kind of issues. And that frankly is the reason that judges are there, is to adjudicate those types of, kind of misalignment, if you will.
Sure.
In this case, I think the takeaways that I have are, first off, you can't let a bully you, right? If you see something wrong, if it doesn't feel quite right, you need to push back. And I think a lot of people are afraid of getting judges involved, or in some ways are, kind of persuaded not to get a judge involved.
Yeah, I've been there.
But, the judges are there to make sure that the games are fair, to make sure that the games are well, I guess, run, if that makes sense. And, they're not going to get everything right 100% of the time. And I have my kind of feedback on the LGT situation. But at the end of the day, they are the authority. They are the ones that can adjudicate. They are the ones that can protect you if you think that something isn't quite right, or if you just need something explained from a third party. So, I mean, that's one thing, right? Is don't hesitate to call a judge. I've never met a judge that I've thought like is out to get anybody, right? When it comes to bullying behavior, I think the unfortunate reality, particularly in our game, is that it's often not known until after it's happened, and a pattern starts to emerge. I think when it comes to common kind of tactics, so what do I mean when I say bullying? It's often materializes as a kind of pushiness in terms of a rule works this way, and kind of doesn't allow for a second opinion or a questioning of the rule. Or I think in this case, what I found was a relatively unique one, is a constant questioning of things that have been established or things that have already, been kind of determined 2 or 3 actions ago. And by actions, I just mean like activation or movement or whatever it is, right? But a constant kind of throwing you off of your game so that you can't think about what's happening now and what's going to happen next, et cetera, right? Everyone's always heard of clock bullying and things like that. It's I would say most, like you had said, it's relatively rare. I think most people are out to have a good game.
I think it's relatively rare. Yeah.
Yeah. But it does happen. And I think in some ways, learning how to deal with that is part of the game. And I would even say that that's not even restricted to 40K, right? I think a lot of the same mentalities that people come into the 40K community with are not very much different from the world in general, right? And so kind of learning how to deal with someone who is bullying at a table or displays bullying behavior, I think is just a universal skill.
Yeah. Can I want to make a suggestion here and see what you think, having been in the situation. I think you were talking earlier about the value of calling a judge and how you need to not be afraid to call a judge. I think there's a lot to be said, especially in a game where you get the feeling that there might be some kind of conflict. And again, I think this is super rare. But calling the judge to ask to have something explained early and about something that's not a big deal, when there's nothing riding on it and it can still be affable, you can establish the notion that the judge is there to help clarify the rules, not there to show up and punish somebody for wrongdoing. Because when you elevate the judge to this position of like, I don't know, Judge Dredd executioner, and that's the only reason you would ever bring them in, there is this sort of social and emotional obstacle to elevating the conflict or the discussion by calling somebody else over. So do you think that maybe there is value in trying to lower the threshold for when you would check in with the judge?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I'm trying to think, there was an example from Flying Monkey, actually. I had requested a judge to come over just to kind of preemptively explain how certain terrain pieces would work, right, for both of us. Just to kind of, level set. As you were saying that, something else struck me, which is, the whole playing by intent piece, right?
Can you just, for people who are new, can you just say why that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I define playing by intent is communication, if you're moving something, you're checking it, right? Everything has to be done as it, if it moves 6 inches, it moves 6 inches. But as you're doing it, if you are trying to ensure that, you're out of a 12-inch charge range or something like that, that you measure it out, that you can physically do it, but then you tell your opponent as you're doing it what you're trying to do and what you're trying to avoid, so that they know, so that, a turn later, they don't, and they can agree, right? That you can agree on it, you can check it, everything is physically there on the table. They might look at it and go, you got to bump it back a little bit. And you go, perfect. All right, great. It's communication. It's making sure that when you do something on your turn, your opponent knows what you're doing, what you're intending to do, and so there's no question about it when it comes to their turn. I think a lot of people play by intent, and they'll go, a turn later, they'll go, oh, I intended to do this. That might be, but, you've really put your opponent on the back foot, basically having to decide, like, yeah, okay, I mean, I guess I wish you had said something sooner, because that would have changed, how I was thinking.
But I think that's the threshold, right? Like, it's if I'm playing my turn and I get to my shooting phase and I obviously put guys in a place to do an action, and at the end of my movement phase, I didn't say they're doing the action, and I start my shooting phase, I think most players are going to be cool about letting me take the action because it doesn't affect the game state in any way, and obviously
Absolutely.
That's what I was intending to do. And even really top competitive players tend to be really cool about that. It's different if your opponent has started making decisions that would have been different decisions, right? I think that really is the threshold for when it starts to become unreasonable to ask your opponent to be cool with you saying that you did something that maybe you didn't declare in phase. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I think that's 100% correct. I think the big just avoidance, right? If you need an example of something to avoid, when, like, for instance, if you're going to move something and then on your opponent's turn, they're going to declare a charge, you can't at that point say, I meant to have this, somewhere else that wasn't
right
within the charge range, right? Like, there's too much that's gone by. There's too much that, it could be a genuine mistake. It could be the intent. But the point is that no one can really say, because there's nothing to look at to say that supports it, right? In your example with maybe someone put a squad in the corner and wanted to do, retrieve Nachman data or something, and then they just, 2 phases later spaced out. And of course they did, right? I mean, that's exactly why they put them there. It makes total sense. Yep, you got the points. Awesome. That's really kind of intent-based play, right? What is the obvious thing that's happened here? What is the clear intention? And then communication. I think communication is the biggest part.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's really what a game is, right? You're telling a story together, you're having a conversation with miniatures on the table, and as long as everybody has the same expectations for what constitutes fair and reasonable play, I think 40K is a great experience. I think where we get ourselves into trouble, you were talking earlier about people coming from different metas, from different play groups, where in some cases different rules are enforced. I mean, I will admit that, for example, the rule with the crew and the platforms, I understand the justification for saying that you can use them to block charging, but it's not something that in my local meta I would ever do. It feels like an error to me in the way the rules are phrased. I think the move blocking, where you don't let somebody move into a ruin, totally makes sense. But crew members who are unengageable in melee, yeah, that's how the rules are written. But there may be metas where that isn't standard play. And so I think we're all coming from places where the game is played a little bit differently, and everybody has to be on board with the notion that at a big tournament, things are going to be slightly different from what you're used to. And we're all kind of making some compromises and coming together and trying to have a shared experience that's not contentious and is a good time. And most of the time it is. 40K is a super cool hobby, and tournaments are not this like cutthroat hellscape of gamesmanship and rules learning that people who have never been to one or maybe went to one 10 years ago seem to think that they are. They're really cool. People go, they play a bunch of 40K, it's fun. Everybody goes to the bar afterwards or goes to the restaurant. You meet new people from all over the world. And it's generally a really good time. And again, we're kind of talking about the in many ways the worst part of the hobby right now, and how to mitigate it and deal with it. But I think it is important to remember that these really are outlier scenarios, and for the most part I think it is a pretty affable, amenable group of people.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I hate to sound down on it, right? Because we're just talking about an unfortunate topic. But I mean, tournaments are, I think the best part about tournaments has nothing to do with the gameplay in general. I mean, you kind of touched on it, but it's, you really do meet a lot of new people and you really do, just go out afterwards, like hang out with people. Honestly, when it comes to, especially in the Midwest, when it comes to tournaments, it's more about looking forward to, seeing people that I haven't seen since the last one.
Sure.
I'm just hanging out and having a good time. So,
yeah, which is super cool. And there are always a few wacky armies. I appreciate too. I was at a GT in August and somebody had 300 Imperial Guardsmen from like a medieval world that were all wearing like breastplates and had bows and were just being pushed by it was not a competitive list. I think he won one game, but man, was it cool. It's fun to see that stuff that you wouldn't necessarily get to see in your local meta. So that we're not finishing up on a gloomy note or a gloomy aspect of the hobby, let's talk about what you are hoping for with the upcoming data slate. And then there's rumors of 10th edition, maybe in a year, maybe not even in that long. What are your expectations, hopes, dreams for Craftworlds going forward?
Yeah, great. Well, so let's start with 10th edition. I think I guess I don't have much of an expectation for it at this point. I'll be curious to see what GW does. I mean, I think they've always done good things in their edition changes. I thought 8th edition was great. I thought 9th edition was even better.
Yeah, me too.
I think a lot of people might disagree with that, but I think the rule set is fantastic.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
We could talk about the roller coaster of factions since, but that's a little bit different. But I'm looking forward to 10th. I would expect next summer. That's kind of on what we expect their timeline to look like. And it also kind of falls in with this new seasonal approach that they've taken with Nephilim and Nachman, etc. So, I think if we see a new season in January and then a new edition in, call it June or July, I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I'm wondering too if this Boarding Actions game that's coming out, for those of you who maybe haven't heard, Boarding Actions is going to be inside of Space Hulks, and it's designed for 500-point play, and we're told that it's going to be a different rule system that you play with your 40k models. And I wonder if we won't see some of the 10th edition rules being test piloted in Boarding Actions. Does that seem like a reasonable inference to you?
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, honestly, I try not to guess at what GW is going to do.
Yeah, fair.
I feel that they have done consistently a pretty good job of bringing good, fun rules. Say what you want about, I think, the faction codexes and how they've played out this edition in terms of their strength versus the field.
Yeah.
I think they've been fun. I think the codexes have felt like the codexes are supposed to feel in a lot of ways. I thought GW's done good with that. It's just the balance that has eluded them at times.
Sure, I think you really nailed it. One of the coolest things about this edition, I think, is it's the first time in the game where I feel like the rules are telling the right story, and that's so cool. Yeah. It's so cool to have your Eldar like shooting and dodging behind ruins and just not dying and pissing off your opponent, but in a way that's not game breaking. Like that's an amazing balance to try to strike. I think that the way they drip feed the codexes is probably incredibly frustrating to the people who write the actual rules, because presumably they create all of these codexes to be balanced against one another, and then when you're bringing them out one at a time over many months, of course it's not balanced. So
I feel so bad for them when it comes to the leaks.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I just really hope that when 10th edition kicks off, either it's drawing on all of the pre-existing codexes in a really successful way, or we get indexes again that balance everything against everything else. Because the issues with game balance, I think, have a lot more to do with the speed with which rules are released rather than overall structural problems, maybe on the front end. But I don't know. Yeah. Like you say, it doesn't make sense necessarily to try to second guess what GW is going to do with reference to rules.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue into the topic of the data slate, which is, I think one thing anyone that played in 7th edition knows that a game designer has to be involved in their balance of their game. If you're not familiar, 7th edition saw not a single FAQ across the entire edition. And it was so broken that nothing was broken, if that makes sense. But you've seen kind of this evolution, particularly of late, of now these quarterly data slates. We'll look for a chapter approved here again in January. And I think it's been a fantastic, change of culture for the company in terms of how they approach their game. It's not perfect. I don't think it'll ever be perfect, but it can always be better, right? You can always be striving for, a better game balance. And I think they've really committed to that. And I think, we certainly have our problems in the meta right now. But knowing that there's a correction in the near future, I think really changes how you can approach, not just the game, but the addition of the game.
Sure.
And how you might look for tournaments and plan for tournaments, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to this data slate, I don't know that Craftworlds need a lot. I do think they could use a little bit of a boost. I personally think the internal balance of the codex is a little bit skewed. And that is reflected in how when you build your list, they almost always start out 70% the same.
Yeah.
But, that's kind of a secondary problem in my mind when you're talking about tournaments, right? Because, as you saw with the release of the codex, you can always have, just one version of the list that's just way too much. And it doesn't matter about the internal balance because just part of the codex is just way too much. I think right now what we have is a little bit of a just a touch under, with some bad internal balance. And so I would like to see a little bit more of the kind of rebalancing of the data sheets. But in terms of, what else I think the Craftworlds need, I think it's just a slight tweaks to their secondaries. To really kind of bring in.
Yeah, when Nephilim came out, everybody was worried about the nerfs to things like Hail of Doom. I was worried about the secondaries. I really think that that's the place where the game is. I think we got some unnecessary point increases, but I think that the secondaries is really where Craftworld Eldar are lagging behind some of the top performing factions. Are we likely to see easy fixes to any of those? If you had to guess,
I mean, it's hard to say. I think there's relatively easy fixes. It just depends on how in depth I think GW considers, a problem, right? We all saw the Warhammer community post the other day about, kind of the win rates, right?
Right.
In terms of where the factions lie. And win rates, they're not the end all be all. They're kind of like the stick in the wind, and then you have to dig down further and to figure out, what's what. But I think if GW approaches rebalancing of the secondaries as kind of like a goal for the data slate, and particularly in the next season, if you will, I think we'll likely see some changes there. And I don't think it has to be much. Like if I had to make a wish list, it would just be give Shroud Runners the Ranger keyword.
Yep.
Give remove that 6-inch restriction. Just make it outside the deployment zone for Hidden Path.
Yeah, it'd be nice. It'd be nice if they had the Resonator Shard keyword.
Yeah, that would be nice.
So good.
It's a nice little boost there. I think Wrath of Cain needs help. I think that's probably the one that needs the most changes to it.
Yeah.
And I would probably just make it so that if you kill something in combat, it's worth 2 victory points rather than 1, and then 4 for the totality.
That would bring it in line with top faction secondaries, and we don't have a really killer one right now, so I feel like that's not unreasonable. It would also give Beltan a little help, which they could use.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing you'd like to see is Beltan or one of the other Craftworlds see some more play, because you hate to walk into a tournament and see Craftworld list and it's just the exact same thing over.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right, last question before we wrap up. What's your favorite crappy unit? Your favorite unit that never makes it into tournament lists? Well, there's no never, but almost never.
Oh, I'm staring at 3 Wraithlords right now.
they're not terrible. They I think Nick Nanavati had one for like 2 games in the middle of the edition.
Yeah.
They're not good, but that'd be
I
nice.
love the Wraith units. I really do. They're such cool models, and I wish I had more reason to put more of them on the board.
Yeah, really distinctive fluff, and even though some of them they're dated, they still look so cool. They look great on the tabletop, despite being old models.
They really do. A friend left a Wraith Knight at my doorstep that he didn't want, and
it's like abandoning an unwanted baby outside of like a nunnery or something. I like that.
They're in the penalty box for a long time now.
Yeah,
but someday I'll put one together again and paint it up and get it out there.
Yeah, I for a while I thought maybe they were the worst Titanic unit in the game, and then like that Orc Titan is pretty crap too. So there might be a contest there between them. All right, man. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to go on the show. I really love your Goonhammer content. I think all of the writing you've done about Craftworlds has been really insightful and just super well done, and is hugely appreciated by the community. For those of you who are out there listening, if you like this video, I hope that you will click like. If you haven't yet subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing, and leaving a comment not only helps out the algorithm, but I bet we could compel James to come back and answer some questions if you leave questions for him in the content or comment section. What do you think, James? Could you answer some questions from viewers for us?
I'd love to.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So maybe we'll try to get him to check back in like a week. If you want to leave comments, that would be awesome. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. That's it this time. Best of luck with your next pointy-eared campaign, and I'll look forward to talking to you all again soon. Take care.